Welcome to the broadcast. This is Brother Eric John Phelps here at 24/7 World Radio on this July 5th, 2023. I will be reading from a work, an introduction to the work titled Jesuit Juggling, 40 Popish Frauds Detected and Disclosed by the great Richard Baxter. Richard Baxter was a Puritan in England, and his ministry extended mostly during the reign of Oliver Cromwell, during the time of the English Civil War and the protectorship of Oliver Cromwell, and that was from 1641 to 1660. Cromwell ruled England for 5 years, from 1653 to 1658, after the Parliament proved that it was insufficient and incapable and too ungodly to rule the people of England. So he dismissed the Parliament one by one, named off all their sins when they were proceeding out the door, and then put the key in his pocket and closed it up. And from then on, he was the protector of England and defender of the faith. Oliver Cromwell is the greatest Bible-believing white man for the last 300 years. Without Oliver Cromwell, there is no George Washington. And Hollis Reed makes this very clear in his great work, The Hand of God in History, in his second volume. Without Oliver Cromwell, there is no George Washington. A few words on Richard Baxter. Richard Baxter was a Puritan. He was Calvinistic, and he did believe that Christ died for the sins of the world and not just for the sins of the elect, so he rejected limited atonement, and rightfully so, because the Bible is clear that Christ's death was sufficient for all, but efficient for his elect. Baxter, it should be remembered that he was requested by Oliver Cromwell to be the chaplain of his Ironsides. Now, the Ironsides of Oliver Cromwell were approximately 1,000 horse. Cromwell recruited them from the Puritan churches in the south of England. He said, I will recruit a group of horsemen that shall never be defeated. And they were never defeated. His Ironside of 1,000 horse were never defeated. And so Cromwell became known for the greatness of his Ironsides, who for the most part were Baptist Puritans and Calvinistic. They used to sing hymns when they went into battle. And after they routed the king's army, in a half an hour, they would slowly walk back to their lines, and one defeat after the next. But it's a great history. You need to be familiar with it. You need to read about the life of Oliver Cromwell by J.T. Headley. And I will also be reading another work on the life of Cromwell that I find just almost as good. Remember, in the past, I read the life of Cromwell into my radio broadcasts, and you can obtain them if you wish to purchase my annual radio broadcast from 2013 to 2022. Baxter, so you want to remember that about Richard Baxter. Now, Baxter, during this time, wrote this work in 1655, titled Jesuit Juggling, 40 Popish Frauds Detected and Disclosed by Richard Baxter. And I thank a dear brother for obtaining this for me. I got it about 2 weeks ago in the mail and have not thanked him yet, but I shall. It starts out, this volume, which discloses the juggling of Jesuits by Richard Baxter, and by it, he being dead yet speaketh, is affectionately inscribed to all junior theologians who already are consecrated to the, quote, ministry of reconciliation, unquote, or who are preparing, quote, earnestly to contend for the faith which was once delivered to the saints, unquote, with devout solicitude, that they may not, quote, fight the dragon and the beast and the false prophet, as one who beateth the air, unquote, but that they may be, quote, more than conquerors through him who loved us, unquote. Those being quotations of several scriptures. New York, October 12th, 1835. That's when this was republished in New York in 1835. We shall read the introduction to this work at this sitting. It will probably take an hour, but I trust that you will enjoy it, as I shall. Address to the ministers, officers, and members of all the Protestant churches in the United States. The rapid increase of the papal apostasy and of the principles of Jesuitism in our republic is the most astonishing modern development of the, quote, mystery of iniquity, unquote. That's out of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Viewed in reference only to civil society, nothing can be more contradictory to all reasonable anticipation than that popery should have been able to force an admission into our community, much less that it should have been acceptable to American citizens. Our whole national polity is so widely severed from the entire system of Romanism, under every possible modification, that the correct motives and the true causes should be ascertained and specified for that astounding aberration from rectitude, self-interest, and decorum, the existence of which the present appalling predominance of popery and the evident extending sway of the Roman pontiff throughout our land so unequivocally shows. This is 1835. All right? This is the same year that the great Samuel Morse wrote his Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States, showing that the Jesuits, through their, out of Vienna, out of Austria, with the Loophole Foundation, launched the attack to conquer America. So the great Samuel Morse writes his work in 1835, and this particular work of Baxter is republished for America in 1835. God is seeking to warn the Americans back then, but unfortunately they would not listen. For which reason they got the war between the states from 1861 to 65, the Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, during which tyrannical occupation of the South, 3 socialist communist amendments were shoved down the throats of the American people: the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. All because they would not heed the warnings of God's men in 1835. The inquiry is often propounded: how can the extraordinary spread of popery and the manifest multiplication of the papists be rationally accounted for in the present state of our country? It is often said in reply that the increase of papal vassals in the United States results entirely from foreign immigration and the expenditure of European money. Admit that the former of those causes augments the number of Roman devotees, and that the latter enables the Jesuits to erect male and female convents and seminaries. Nevertheless, both do not exhibit the whole existing relative position of the pontifical authority in our confederated republics. Remember, the United States was a confederation of sovereign nation states, as this author rightfully declares. 2 anomalous facts undeniably declare that other causes are in operation which give life and encouragement to the efforts that Roman priests and disguised Jesuits make to subjugate these states to the Italian pontiff. Neither the crowds of papists who are constantly arriving, nor the sums of money which are regularly transmitted from Europe, at all account for the peculiar favor with which Romanism is regarded, and the special solicitude which so many citizens exemplify to propagate its priests. Nor do those principles afford any plausible solution of another mysterious circumstance, that the whole body of American citizens are manifestly imbued with an overpowering dread of the malign influence and appalling machinations of the papists. That's right, because you see, they remember the Inquisition. They remember the English Civil War. They remembered the horrible, terrible attempted invasion of the Spanish Armada in 1688. They remember the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. They remember Cromwell's Civil War. They remember all these histories. The Americans of 1835. They remember the War of 1812 was put upon them by King George III, who was run by the Jesuits. They're remembering that the war was put upon them with the Revolutionary War by King George III. King George protecting the Jesuits during their suppression by the Pope. They knew that the horrible, terrible British guns and ships and soldiers that were brought here and their rapine and murder of Protestants when they would run the Protestants into their Protestant churches and set them on fire. They knew that this was done by the Jesuits in control of King George III. So they dreaded the popery. They dreaded all these hundreds of thousands of Irish Catholics and Italian Catholics being brought to America, and especially after the war between the states. The purpose was to make America Catholic. And they were busy doing this in 1835 at the time of this republication of Baxter's great works that we're reading here now, titled Juggling of Jesuits. Continuing on Roman numeral page 8, there has been a general neglect of that department of ecclesiastical literature which comprises the history of the Christian Church, and especially of that portion of which appertains to the papal hierarchy. Except in a few more prominent stations, popery was almost unknown in the United States. Until subsequent to our last contest with Britain, that was the War of 1812, nor had its progress attracted any marked interest until about 6 years ago, that would be 1829. It was first proposed that an attempt should be made to direct the attention of the Protestant churches to the character, wiles, and pernicious acts of the grand apostate enemy of the kingdom of God. From that cause, the recent polemical discussions concerning the, quote, lying wonders and strong delusion, unquote, of pontifical Rome have either been disregarded or opposed. And there is an almost universal dearth of information respecting the scriptural prophecies and delineations of that enemy of, quote, our Lord and of his Christ, unquote, who is generally denominated, quote, the man of sin, unquote, the, quote, scarlet-colored beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns, unquote, and, quote, mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth, unquote, of Revelation 17. It is also not a little perplexing that the Apocalypse, to the reading and hearing of the words of which book alone of the sacred canon, a unique blessing is attached by the, quote, faithful witness and prince of the kings of the earth, unquote. The Apocalypse, or the Revelation of John, is far less studied in its connection with the past annals of the Christian Church than any other portion of, quote, the oracles of God, unquote. Hence, there is an almost universal ignorance or misconception of the genuine attributes and ungodly proceedings of the Romish, quote, seducing spirits and false teachers who speak lies in hypocrisy, unquote. The predominating sensibility throughout the American Protestant churches is an undefinable dread of the Pope's vassals who are domiciled among us, from which cause public controverted discussions of the dogmas, superstitions, frauds, and corruptions of popery and Jerusalem are sternly counteracted. Publications both in the form of volumes and periodicals are slighted and decried. Houses of prayer are peremptorily refused for the purpose of preaching the gospel of Christ in illustration of scriptural predictions. And not only is every effort to arouse the slumbering disciples repelled, but those watchmen who, quote, see the sword coming upon the land and blow the trumpet to warn the people, unquote, are censored, denounced, as if they were disturbers of the public peace. This is not the work of our Romish inveterate adversaries. Having latterly discovered that their scornful superstition of Protestants excited both disgust and alarm, the Jesuits now have become comparatively lamb-like and, quote, beguile with enticing words, unquote. They perceive that the cause of their foreign despot, the Roman pontiff, is more efficiently promoted in this republic by their deceptions than by their menaces, and through their covert artifices than with open assault. The combined apathy and opposition of Protestant ministers and other influential professed adherents of the Reformation are consolidating the papal system and facilitate its enlargement and sway throughout the United States far more than all the priest-ridden multitudes who are transported from Europe and all the treasures which pontifical ambition and ignorant bigotry can squander upon the marvelous design to subjugate the minds and hearts, the bodies and souls of American citizens to the accursed iron yoke of Pope Gregory. That is Pope Gregory the 16th, who was the Pope at this time in 1835. Whence does this slavish fear of the papists emanate? There is a deep-rooted impression that the vassals of Rome are a turbulent, lawless, and ferocious confederacy who are impelled by an unprincipled priesthood. What are the Jesuits and Dominicans? Men who know no authority but the supreme pontifical mandate, who are united to mankind by none of the natural bonds of relationship, who have no motive of action but personal indulgence and the aggrandizement of their craft, and who being exempt from all government, except that of their ecclesiastical superiors, and having no permanent residence, because they are always subject to the order of removal from their prelatical master, constantly and in every place are the enemies of all that portion of the human family who will not submit to their infernal despotism. Therefore, timid Protestants conclude that it is preferable not to irritate the beast, lest they should feel the compound anguish arising from the bear's gripe. That would probably be grip, G-R-I-P-E, and the lion's mouth, inflicted with leopard-like suddenness and ferocity. Baxter has luminously depicted that absurdity. Quote, some think that it is the safest way to please the Pope and Jesuits, and so will be papists, unquote, or support their cause, quote, on the same terms that some of the Indians worship the devil, because he is so not, that he may not hurt them, unquote. If we reflect upon the present situation of Jesuitism in this republic in 1835, it is scarcely credible that the reverend author of the, quote, Juggling of Jesuits, unquote, 180 years ago, so 180 years minus 1835 brings us out to, what, 1655. 180 years ago could have so precisely described existing realities. That's because the Jesuits never change. What they were and what they did in 1655 is what they were doing in 1835, is what they're doing now in 2023. As Jesuit General Lorenzo Ricci said to King Louis XV, when Louis XV said, can't the Jesuits change? And he said in Latin, let them be as they are, or else not be. The Jesuits never change. Their devices, they do. They change their devices and their plans and their plotting, but it's still the same army with still the same quest. World government under the Pope of Rome to the destruction of the Protestant Reformation in the West. Continuing. If we reflect upon the present situation of Jesuitism in this republic, it is scarcely credible that the revered author of the Juggling of Jesuits, which is Richard Baxter, 180 years ago, could have so precisely described existing realities. Vast numbers of Protestants act upon the same principle as the man who bowed to the images of Jupiter and Satan. When he was reproved for his infatuation, he retorted, quote, it is impossible to know what may happen or where we may go, so it is best to have friends in every place, unquote. But who can estimate the mischiefs that follow from the large donations which are made not only by merely nominal Protestants, but also by actual members of the Reformed churches, towards the erection of those idolatrous temples where the Roman superstitious ceremonial is performed? In many places throughout our land, the sites of the edifices or materials for the erection of them, or money to pay the mechanics, have been profusely lavished by the avowed followers of Christ to complete mass houses and Jesuit male and female convents. To admit that those donors thus bestowed their gifts from a profound non-acquaintance with popery is an impeachment of their rationality. And yet to suppose that they have thrown away their superfluous wealth from a predilection for Romanism, or from a supposition that it is Christianity, altogether makes void their sincerity. Whatever may be the cause, the effects are most pernicious. The energies of the Protestant champions are enfeebled, and the power of the Roman priests is invigorated and becomes more extensive and unshaken. Since the commencement of the more direct, quote, war upon the beast, unquote, in America, nearly 6 years have passed away. That's from 1829 to 1835. Nearly 6 years have passed away, and 2 facts have been elicited from the occurrences which have transpired. The vast majority of American citizens, and even of American Christians, are nearly altogether ignorant of popery, and a spurious liberalism prevails throughout our country. Liberalism. That's a Romish liberalism. That's a toleration of the papacy. This is the liberalism that's being taught at every major university in this country, which includes socialism. That's right, so he says, a spurious liberalism prevails throughout our country, which unfolds itself nearly in our Lord's graphical description of the ancient Jewish blind guides, quote, who strained at a gnat and swallowed a camel, unquote. It is demonstrable that each of those principles, and especially both them conjoined, must have a decisively injurious tendency upon the churches of Christ. Popery, through their joint operation, is considered to be either harmless, and so may be tolerated without opposition, or it is viewed as a species of modified Christianity, which demands our occasional conformity with its principles and ritual. By the way, there's nothing about ritual in the New Testament. No New Testament church has a ritual. That's all popish or apostate Protestant or Masonic. Freemasonry has rituals. Anything that has rituals is evil, is cultish. Such a contradictory interpretation of Scripture can arise only from an entire ignorance of the 10th and the subsequent chapters of the Apocalypse. However incompetent through our finite judgments we may be to determine the times and seasons, and also some of the prophetical figures, with the application of them, yet one thing is certain, as derived from the whole tenor of the sacred volume, that idolatry is a crime most abhorrent to Jehovah, that the system of popery is doomed by God to utter destruction, and that all papists, being idolaters, unless they come out of Babylon the Great, will be, quote, partakers of her sins and will receive of her plagues, unquote. The erroneous judgment that is formed of the genuine attributes of Romanism is both the cause and effect of that false charity which urges so many of our citizens to look with complacency upon the anti-Christian system and to confer it on account of its fraudulent appellative as an emanation from, quote, the glorious gospel of the ever-blessed God, unquote. The same combined delusion and fondness for its pageantry, its music, its ornaments, and its shows actuate that resistance which is so general and so continuously displayed to the use of evangelical means for the overthrow of popery. Indeed, it seems to be entirely forgotten by almost all orders of people, both within the church and in the world, that, quote, the working of Satan, unquote, is a most alarming curse to every nation who tolerate and succumb to it, and that, quote, the testimony of Jesus which is the spirit of prophecy, unquote, has distinctly foretold that the admission and progress of, quote, the mystery of iniquity, unquote, among any community is a decisive expression of the displeasure of Jehovah, designed by him as a punishment for their transgressions and their sins. Thus, the Apostle Paul, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 10 through 12, emphatically declares, quote, they received not the love of the truth that they might be saved. For this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they all may be damned, who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Unquote. This reflection is peculiarly impressive if considered in connection with the retributive dispensations of the omnipotent Creator. We have always boasted of the unequaled illumination and freedom which overspread our country, and the questions instantly arise, has that light been duly improved? Has that liberty been used for evangelical objects, like preaching the gospel, and according to divine prescriptions? Question mark. Reflect upon the contrast. Popery is a system of darkness and slavery, mental, body, and spiritual. Nothing more directly at the antipodes of all our Republican civic theories in legislation and political economy can possibly be imagined than the dogmas, injunctions, and appointments of the Court of Rome, exclusive of their total contradiction to Christianity with a capital C, and yet that, quote, son of perdition, quote unquote, who has withered the comforts, blasted the prosperity, promoted the contentions, extinguished the improvements, polluted with blood, and because it is a ceaseless God-robber, Malachi 3, verses 8 and 9, has, quote, cursed with a curse, unquote, during the last 1,200 years, every one of the 10 kingdoms of the beast is now nourished in this country as if he were, quote, the friend of sinners and the Prince of Peace, unquote. Those irreconcilable contradictions between all that Americans exult in, of the rights of conscience and civil liberty, when contrasted with the gloom and vassalage of the papacy, combine the most intensely exciting inquiries in reference to the prospective advances of the pontifical predominance throughout our land. Here we have a fact which in its primary aspect appears to be utterly inexplicable. Utterly inexplicable, that men who are sensitive beyond description to the least apparent infringements of their privileges by their own elected official personages, at the same time deliberately choose and obstinately encourage the grasping usurpations of a foreign despotic potentate, whose boundless arrogance claims the unlimitable control of all the affairs of every individual, not only during his earthly pilgrimage, but throughout eternal ages, and also assumes to determine and regulate not merely his own forced and voluntary minions, but the concerns of all the tribes of mankind, without a murmur of resistance and forever. Whether the supreme and all-righteous arbiter of human transactions would alarm us by the fearful intimation that he can permit men voluntarily so to blind themselves that they will aid the tyrant to forge the chains which shall fetter themselves and build the prison for their own incarceration, and manufacture the scourges with which themselves shall be lacerated, is a topic which demands serious investigation and may properly excite penitent humility. The signs of the times are full of melancholy portents for the American churches, and that light of which in one aspect we have boasted, and in another endeavored to extinguish, is rapidly becoming obscured by the smoke of the bottomless pit. And that liberty which has been so perverted into licentiousness on one side, and been so grievously despoiled on the other, seems to be gradually transforming into the feudal bondage of the Dark Ages, when a monk's cowl was the highest object of reverence, and a friar's approbation was the most richly valued possession. If we were asked for an example of human depravity, which should be too palpable to admit either of denial or proof, we would adduce the present condition of popery in the United States. No other reason can be assigned for the progress which it has made and the cordiality with which it has been received than the sanction which indirectly by example and immediately by its accommodating doctrines and license, that, quote, all deceivableness of unrighteousness, unquote, imparts to every unhallowed indulgence. Popery is silently but gradually undermining all the moral principles of our people. Quote, and I'll add, back in 2023, it's the papacy that's in charge of all pornography. Through the mafia and intelligence community, demoralizing the entire nation. The Pope's the biggest pornographer in the world. But going back to our book. Quote, the leaven, the doctrine of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees, unquote, almost imperceptibly, except unto a very perspicacious observer, is embittering and corrupting our whole code of ethics, both theoretical and in practice. Examine 3 facts in connection with the 4th, 7th, and 9th commandments. What has been the prime cause of that vast addition to the Sabbath breaking, which in our large cities especially has transformed the latter half of the Lord's Day into one unrestricted scene of sensual revelry? What are this is 1835, okay. What are the Sunday evening, quote-unquote, sacred concerts, unquote, as they are called, but an excuse for the continued perpetration of the regular dissoluteness of the other 6 days, with the scene and place only shifted from the seductive theater to the fascinating garden? This is a masterpiece of Satan, to gild over Sabbath breaking with a pretended sacred concert, as if anything could be sacred, where theatrical profligates perform. That's what we have today in Hollywood. Nothing but a bunch of theatrical profligates. They're filthy, they're dirty, they're constantly fornicating, whatever. They're theatrical profligates. Perform. And notorious, quote, lovers of pleasure, unquote, resort. But it is the genuine effect of popery. The papist Sabbath ends as soon as Mass is closed, and then every species of inordinate gratification may be indulged with impunity. The desecration of the Lord's Day is one of the indelible and most obvious features of the popedom, and as the natural and inevitable consequence, infidelity, and all diversified ungodliness with their ineffable evils speedily overflow the land. That's why we got gambling everywhere. Gambling out there in New Orleans, or out in Nevada, and a host of other things. All from popery to demoralize the population and fit us for servitude and a military dictatorship subject to the Pope. Indeed, the desecration of the Lord's Day is one of the indelible and most obvious features of the popedom, and as the natural and inevitable consequence, infidelity, and all diversified ungodliness with their ineffable evils, that's unspeakable evils, speedily overthrow the land. That's right, there's some things you can't talk about, they're so wicked. It being also proper to be remembered that this dishonor of the Lord's Day, so far from being condemned by the papal creed, is an essential ingredient in their system, and from their superstitions inseparable, because the more sin you have, the more you need to have them forgiven, and therefore the more you need the priests, and therefore the more they need the candles. Sin builds popery. The transgression of the 7th commandment is indissolubly conjoined with popery. And that's, of course, thou shalt not commit adultery. That characteristic of the Romish apostasy is declared by both the apostles Paul and John to be an infallible mark of the mystical Babylon. And according to the testimony of the papal historians, the scriptural delineations are most minutely accurate. That the various crimes and the scandalous disorders which are implied in the Lord's mandate are increasing not only in frequency, but also in openness, and likewise in aggravated enormity is a fact which is so obvious that, alas, it requires no evidence to verify its melancholy truth. Can it be believed that Jesuitism is not principally chargeable with this awfully wide-spreading desolation? That's sexual sin, adultery, fornication. Is that not what the Jesuits promoted in their Hollywood? And by the way, the 4 leading works during the coming Great Tribulation, according to the book of Revelation, are fornication, sorcery, theft, and murder, growing in leaps and bounds every year in this country, thanks to popery and Hollywood and slapping the wrists and not punishing criminals. That's why the papacy is all against capital punishment. You know that. Because they want sin to prosper. Continuing. And why doth treason prosper? Well, none dare call it treason. Nobody's going to dare blame the papacy for all that they put upon us. Why, that would be intolerable, wouldn't it? Do not the Jesuit priests teach that many of the sins of unchastity are merely venial? Are they not pardoned for a slight penance? Are not dispensations for all past delinquencies sold for a trifle? Cannot indulgence for 1 or more years be obtained for a given price, which permits the purchaser to violate the law of God as often as he pleases, and promises him exemption from the divine displeasure? When we remember the proportion of papists in our large cities and towns, is it possible that such an irreligious and contaminating system should exist and be in full operation among them, and that all other persons should escape the infectious contagion? Of course not. Is it conceivable that the large multitudes of sinners who are anxious to live unrestrained by the jurisdiction of Jehovah will not be gratified without examining its genuineness? With a pretended Christianity which tolerates them in every licentious practice and which guarantees their eventual security through the power of a priesthood so condescending to human propensities and whose beneficence is so cheaply purchased? Encourage sin that we can get enriched and bring the nation under the judgment of God. Chineke wrote the same kind of things in 50 Years in the Church of Rome in 1886. Continuing. But probably surveyed in all their operations in civil society throughout our Federal Republic, the doctrines and practices of the Jesuits and other Roman priests and their devotees respecting the 9th commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, against the 9th commandment, are more pernicious than even the desecration of the Sabbath and the deluge of impurity with which they are desolating public morals and decorum. The equivocations, mental reservations, nullifying of oaths, infringement of covenants, and in short, all the innumerable modes which these deceivers have invented to invalidate apparently the most solemn obligations, and yet to remove any dread of guilt from the falsifiers, are the most awful proofs of outrageous impiety and daring perfidy which are found among human annals. And I would add, this is why in the oath of the Vice President, he takes his oath without mental reservation. The whole doctrine of mental reservation was perfected by the Jesuits. And if there's one who is a Jesuit in office, who uses mental reservation all the time, it's none other than Irish Roman Catholic Joe Biden. The real president, when Barry Davis Obama was the president for 8 years, and now he's been the president for what's going on 3 years now, So Biden's been ruling this country for 11 years, overseen by the Jesuits of Georgetown University. And he has mental reservation all the time. He lies all the time. He doesn't want to keep his presidential oath. And so this is exactly what this author talks about. It's ridiculous to believe that an honest Roman Catholic would ever keep his oath other than to the Pope of Rome. Yet all those perjuries of the most flagrant character are constantly perpetrated in the United States, and by all classes of papists, not only with impunity, but with the approbation and according to the instruction of their priests. Approbation means approval. And according to the instruction of their priests. Can those barefaced violations of truth and sincerity be openly displayed without injury to others who witness them? You see, sin is contagious. That's what the author is saying. Sin is contagious. Wickedness is contagious. It's like weeds. It's contagious. And it spreads unless it's stopped. As the old saying goes, you have to pull the weeds so the grass can grow, or the weeds will choke it out. Can those barefaced violations of truth and sincerity be openly displayed without injury to others who witness them? Can the doctrine that the Roman pontiff and his subordinate priests can nullify an oath or a contract and dispense with the most solemn obligations and authorize deliberate perjury be openly taught as a part of the Romish religion without deteriorating the minds and consciences of men not possessed of the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom? Lying and false swearing are essential to every existence of popery. It must also be remembered that the Sabbath breaking, uncleanness, and deception, that's sexual uncleanness and deception, lying, are taught in all the seminaries and convents, whether of boys or girls in this union. It is of no importance by what name those institutions are known. And if you want to read about it or listen to a tape on it, you need to listen to the testimony of Sister Charlotte, made in the 1950s, when this dear nun escaped her convent. It's unbelievable. The testimony of Sister Charlotte, made public by the ex-Jesuit Alberto Rivera. Thank God for his ministry and testimony, and brought out that wonderful recording of the testimony of Sister Charlotte. If you've not listened to it, you need to listen to it and weep. Continuing. It is of no importance by what name those institutions are known. Jesuit priests and Ursuline nuns substantially impart the knowledge and entice to the doing of all that loathsome iniquity. This is one of the great prospective dangers of our country. Multitudes of youth and of the most influential rank in the American community recently have been and now are in the course of tuition under those consummate adepts in every diabolical art. From their course of tuition, all evangelical instruction is most cautiously excluded. The juvenile mind is enchanted with pomp and mummery, and beguiled with blandishments, or menaced with alarm, or operated upon by both alternately, until the creature has become a mere machine which the priestly artificer adapts to any purpose that may promote his designs or gratify his vicious desires. And by the way, the Catholics at this time in 1835 were all going to Catholic schools. They refused to go to the public schools or the common schools because there, in those common schools started by the Puritans, they would be reading the Bible. And the last thing the priests wanted the Catholic people to do was ever read the Bible. Until 1963, when the Jesuit-controlled Supreme Court, run by 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason Earl Warren, kicked the Bible out of the public schools, to the delight of the Jesuits. And from then on, the papacy said, well, then we really don't need our Catholic schools. They can go to the public schools. They're going to be just as paganized there as it would in our schools, because they took the Bible out. Continuing. All that youth truly learn in any Jesuit institution, whether it be a college or nunnery, is the most efficient manner to impose upon the world around them. The most efficient manner to impose upon the world around them. That is beyond all dispute the most dangerous of all the results which flow from those monastic establishments in which Protestant boys and girls are immured. There they learn every possible abomination and are also taught every ingenious device by which they can elude discovery in the midst of their crimes, and deceive all persons who are not minutely conversant with their shenanery and turpitude. And I was a part of this. I was raised around Roman Catholics. We used to curse and swear and write nude pornography on the walls on the way to school. That's what we did. That's good Catholic culture. And by the way, there's another book you want to read. It's called Crime and Immorality in the Catholic Church by Emmett McLaughlin. He also wrote another book called The People's Padre. He also wrote a book on the assassination of Abraham, Rome's responsibility in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Get it? The People's Padre. Rome's and Crime and Immorality in the Catholic Church by Emmett McLaughlin. He was a former Franciscan priest. He left the papacy, but unfortunately he joined the Masonic Lodge. Nonetheless, the books are good. Jesuitism cannot proceed onward in its progress throughout our country as it has done for the last 10 years without speedily illustrating its baneful effects in the increasing indifference of the public to sterling knowledge, in growing immorality, in prevailing skepticism, in a silent but systematic and deadly change in the spirit of our statute laws, and in an accelerating corruption and debasement of the national character. And by the way, Emmett McLaughlin's work, Crime and Immorality in the Catholic Church, shows you that there are more Roman Catholics in jail than Protestants. And that is a statistical fact. Even when the Protestants outnumber the Catholics in the population, you still have more Roman Catholics in jail. Why? Because they were taught all their sin by the priests in the schools they attended. Jesuitism cannot exercise its present wicked influence many years longer before the Christian churches, and those are Protestant and Baptist, Christian churches will find themselves cowering to the audacity and writhing under the usurpations of those vile emissaries of the Roman pontiff. That's right, because they're going to be in government. They're going to command the armies and the navies. They're going to command downtown courthouses. And you're going to see how much they tolerate you, my white Anglo-Saxon Protestant and Baptist friend. They don't tolerate you now. I was persecuted by one of those Roman Catholic wenches when she refused to fire my paperwork many years ago down at the Lancaster Prothonotary. Her name was Anne. I'll never forget her. It is therefore, quote, high time to awake out of sleep, to cast off the works of darkness, and to put on the armor of light, unquote. The welfare of the community and the vital interests of the Christian churches are deeply concerned in a prompt renovation of the character and actions of Protestants in reference to popery. Two measures are indispensable: an accurate and a general acquaintance with the qualities and mischievous effects of the grand apostasy, and the adoption of efficient and evangelical means to counteract and diminish that unholy predominance which the Roman accursed despotism has already attained. The former course necessarily implies the dissemination of knowledge by periodicals, standard volumes, and popular discussions, especially by lectures on the prophecies which avert to Romanism. The latter comprises a correct understanding of the evils which flow from the existence of popery in its connection with civil society, and of the proper methods to extirpate the insidious poison which it infuses into the whole mass of the community, and by which their energies are paralyzed, and the system corrupted with a loathsome and direful mortification. With this point, however, the Christian churches, Bible-reading Christian churches, here the AV 1611 Bible-reading Christian churches in 1835, in their associated relations cannot interfere. No man wishes to infringe upon the rights of conscience, and no citizen would be willing to rebuild the dungeons, forge the fetters, sharpen the sword, and kindle the fires of Dominican inquisitors and papal butchers. It may confidently be anticipated that the conflagrations of the auto de fe, that's the public burning in the public squares, the auto de fe, and the indiscriminate massacre of Protestants by the bloodhounds of the mother of harlots, who furnished the blood of the saints with which she became drunken, have passed away, not to be reiterated. Yeah. But the events which have occurred since the commencement of that shaking of the nations, the French Revolution in 1789, not only in France, but also in Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Austria, assure us that the Romish priestly assassins will not surrender their stilettos, their poison, their frauds, and their long-enjoyed supremacy without a struggle. This author doesn't understand that the Jesuits caused the French Revolution to punish the monarchs of Europe and even the Pope himself for suppressing the Jesuit order. Portugal in 1759, Spain in 1767, France in 1764, and the Pope himself in 1773. That was punishment. That was Jesuit vengeance, called the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. Continuing on. Which, although it will terminate in their overthrow, will previously have convulsed the nations who had submitted to them, to their center, and will spread desolation, anguish, penury. Penury is poverty. That's what we're all in today, poverty. And slaughter through all their boundaries to the utmost extremity. That would be the war between the states from 1861 to 65. The United States of America will not escape the experience of the storm and the woe in exact proportion to the number of the papal ecclesiastics and the extent to which their power and abominations have controlled throughout our country. As an aside, I want to mention that in the war between the states, the War of Northern Aggression, the Jesuits controlled both sides. The powerful Jesuit in Washington, overseeing the radical red Republicans in the North, was a man named Bernardin F. Wiggett. And F. Tupper Saucy writes about him in his Rulers of Evil. And Bernardin F. Wiggett is the one who orchestrated and oversaw the plot to assassinate Lincoln, because Lincoln didn't go along with the radical red Republicans, so they just got rid of him. Bernardin F. Wiggett oversaw that. Bernardin F. Wiggett was very much involved in the designs of the Yankee Union generals. But in the South, the leading chaplain of the Confederacy was a Jesuit named Father Darius Hubert. There's a book by Catherine Bentley Jeffrey titled First Chaplain of the Confederacy, Father Darius Hubert, S.J. And this Jesuit, the chief Jesuit chaplain of the Confederacy, met with certain Yankee Union generals when they were occupying Richmond and greeted them as old friends. And you can read about it in this book. The Jesuits ran both sides in that war, decimated the country, caused 650,000 deaths, and God knows how many injuries and terrible amputations. And this author warns of it in 1835. And his warning went unheeded. Continuing. It is therefore desirable to promulgate among our churches a work that exhibits in the most compendious form, that means all-encompassing form, the various artifices by which the emissaries of the Roman Pontiff endeavor to delude the unwary to their ruin, thereby to enlighten those who are not acquainted with the fallacies of the popish corruptions, and also to excite becoming watchfulness on the part of the Protestant churches against the snares of their insidious foes. Absolutely right. Back in the 1600s, the seminaries back then, for their Protestant ministers, they had a class called Jesuit casuistry. They would teach the young ministers all the designs of the Jesuits, give historical examples of what they've done to prepare them for the day when those Protestant and Baptist ministers would have to resist them too. We don't have that in any Bible college or any seminary in this country, including Calvin College, Messiah College in Pittsburgh, or Lancaster Bible College, or Clark Summit University. None of them are going to tell you. Why, that would be, what was this, sexist, racist, and bigoted. That would be bigoted. Yeah, telling the truth about the papacy. Go on. Against the snares of their insidious foes. For that purpose, the best, probably, of all the controversial disquisitions by the immortal Richard Baxter was selected. Richard Baxter. During the civil commotions in Britain, which followed the lawlessness and destructive exhibitions of quote-unquote kingcraft by James I and Charles I, the Jesuits attempted to increase the ferment and the divisions among the Protestants. Remember, the Jesuits tried to kill James I with the gunpowder plot in 1605. James would later begin to go along with the Jesuits after the Jesuits murdered Henry IV in 1610. Then Charles I, James's son, comes to the throne, totally in the hands of the Jesuits, for which the Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell, would put him to death and cut his head off for the traitor that he was. Thank God. Glory, hallelujah. Baxter was invited to be Cromwell's chaplain of his Ironsides, as I mentioned, but Baxter refused, for which he later regretted that decision. Going on. For that purpose, the best, probably, of all the controversial disquisitions by the immortal Richard Baxter was selected. During the civil commotions in Britain, which followed the lawless and destructive exhibitions of kingcraft, quote-unquote, by James I and Charles I, the Jesuits attempted to increase the ferment and the divisions among the Protestants, that the unthinking multitudes, weary of their unceasing commotions, might for quietude, as they supposed, take refuge in the Jesuits' absolution and within the turrets of Babylon. The authentic history of that period certifies that to accomplish their schemes, every subterfuge and trick were adopted by those ingenious and fox-like masters of fraud and deception. They had received dispensations from the Pope and the general of their order, that's the Jesuit general, the Black Pope, to wear every kind of visor, to appear in all sorts of disguise, to assume any name or profession, and to perpetrate every possible crime so as to promote the grand scheme, the restoration of the pontifical authority throughout those kingdoms. And that's exactly what John Adams and Jefferson wrote about in their letters of 1819. We shall not see Jesuits in every disguise in this country now that they've been revived by the Pope in 1814. The consequence of those papal indulgences, Jesuits, in consequence of those papal indulgences, Jesuits were found in all characters, and always exceeding in extravagance even the wildest effervescence of those who felt more than ordinary excitement during that agitated period. It was then partially known, and has since been amply ascertained and proved, that nuns obtruded themselves among the female followers of George Fox. That's George Fox of Fox's Book of Martyrs. And that many of the scandalous public exhibitions of women in a state of nudity were by those well-trained prostitutes of the Romish priests. That's why the priests run prostitution today. That's why they have their charm schools, where they groom women to be presidential prostitutes. If you don't believe me, read Kathy O'Brien's work, Transformation of America. She was one of them. The leaders also of those minor sects who promulgated as their cardinal tenet a community of property and sexual intercourse were chiefly Jesuits and nuns, or others whom they had carefully selected as suitable tools to carry on their pernicious schemes. This is community of property. This is communism. And they chose Marx to be the one that they would attribute the Communist Manifesto in 1848. This is a mere 13 years after the writing of this book. So they're going to have communal sex, communism. And he says, this work was chiefly Jesuits and nuns, or others whom they had artfully selected as suitable tools to carry on their pernicious schemes. Many of those who pretended to be preachers of different sects and who were distinguished for the infuriated extravagance of their opinions and the apparent madness of their behavior were Roman priests and monks. And I maintain to you that the man behind the horrible, terrible killing of those people in the Salem witch trials, that priest, that supposed Protestant, was a Jesuit. Check him out. He was a Jesuit. Perfectly described by this author. Were Roman priests and monks who had but one design: to augment the national discord, to disgrace Protestantism, to deceive the ignorant, and thus to proselyte the people to the Roman superstitions. Baxter wrote the ensuing work expressly to unfold their wickedness, and it is a lasting memento that popery is immutable in its treachery and ungodliness. Indeed, we read, talk about Richard Baxter here, Baxter wrote the ensuing work expressly to unfold their wickedness, and it is a lasting memento that popery is immutable in its treachery and ungodliness. The one that was used to bring great discord and shame upon Protestants and Puritans was Cotton Mather and his Salem witch trials. Cotton Mather was a Jesuit. No Bible-believing Puritan would ever conduct witch trials unless motivated by Jesuit designs. And that's exactly what happened. Going on. There's some of the doctrines he advocated too. I'll do a broadcast on Cotton Mather one of these days. Continuing, page 22, Roman numeral, introduction. The attentive American reader of the, quote, juggling of Jesuits, unquote, and the specifications of the, quote, 40 popish frauds, unquote, which Richard Baxter has detected and disclosed, will be deeply impressed with the exact similitude which there is between the period of Oliver Cromwell's supremacy in Britain and the principles and acts of the Jesuits in this republic. In other words, what they tried to pull off in Oliver Cromwell's England, they're trying to pull off here because the Jesuits hated Cromwell. Cromwell broke their power and properly blamed them for the entire civil war of nearly 10 years, from 1642 to 1652. They hated him. That's why they hate him in England. That's why you can't find a decent history on Oliver Cromwell in England. They hate him. And as I said, without Cromwell, we have no George Washington. So what the Jesuits pulled in Cromwell's Commonwealth, they pulled in the American George Washington's Republic. Admitting even that a modern polemic could have composed a volume exactly identical in fervor and in materials, it would not have been in any way so impressive as this development of the spirit and practices of Jesuitism, which was first published 180 years since. That's Baxter wrote this book, wrote his work 1655, and this is 1835. And which, as is exactly adapted to the present situation of Romanism in the United States, as if it had been composed under the superintendence of the spirit of prophecy, or as if it had been a philosophical and historical delineation of a pre-existent controversy. In other words, what they did in Cromwell's England, they did here, and it's identical. Among the multifarious polemical works in reference to Romanism and the means which its treacherous partisans used to disseminate it in this country, it is believed that no treatise could be selected which presents stronger claims than the attention of the ministers. Well, again, it is believed that no treatise could be selected which presents stronger claims upon the attention of the ministers, officers, and members of the American churches than this display of, quote, Jesuitical juggling, unquote, by Richard Baxter. Not only does he confute the system of popery as incurably corrupt and totally anti-Christian by a few concise arguments which all can comprehend, but he also describes the dexterous artifice of the Jesuits so lucidly and in such diversified forms that none can deny the accuracy of the narrative, and no one can plead an excuse for being ensnared by their, quote, slight and cunning craftiness, whereby they lay in wait to deceive, unquote, portion of Scripture. It is deliberate treason to the Lord of all. Is it deliberate treason to the Lord of all, or is it judicial infatuation in all those ministers and members of the Christian churches who assert that the alarm respecting popery is fictitious, and that the battle with Jesuitism has not yet to be fought in this union? Yeah, that would come with the war between the states. Are there not at the present hour, probably 1,200,000 papists in the United States, with 500,000 more in Canada at the north, and several millions adjoining on the southwest in Mexico? Are not France and Spain and Portugal and Ireland and Austria constantly disgorging the very dregs of Romish ecclesiastical corruption in the shape of monks and nuns upon our land, and in a continuously augmenting stream? Monks and nuns also of such abandoned profligacy, that means they're constantly having sex and fornicating, God knows what else, that even those pitiable priest-ridden slaves could no longer tolerate their turpitude or their existence among them. We're getting rid of all these immoral monks and nuns, sending them over here. Yeah, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. Yeah, send all the Roman Catholic priests over here with your Roman slaves so you can bring all your sin and wickedness and turpitude and perfidy. Bring them all over here for the corruption of America. Is exactly what the Jesuits have done, because they know a corrupt population can only be governed by an absolutist dictator. The more sin, the more the Jesuits like it. The more sin, the more absolutism can be justified. The more gun crime, the more gun confiscation can be advocated. It's the same game. Continuing. Monks and nuns also of such abandoned profligacy that even those pitiable priest-ridden slaves could no longer tolerate their turpitude or their existence among them. You read 50 Years in the Church of Rome, when this one priest was going up at night and fornicating with this one nun, and the men of the town knew about it, and so they met him one night coming back on a trail, and they bullwhipped the priest. Read about it. Read about these Frenchmen in Quebec bullwhipping the priest for fornicating with a nun. 50 Years in the Church of Rome. It's exactly what this guy's talking about here. And it's about the same time period, in the 1830s. The time will speedily arrive when their morbid influence will be felt by the body politic, and their iron grasp will convince our citizens that if they would preserve their rights and enjoy the gospel, they must, quote, put on the whole armor of God and wrestle against the rulers of the darkness of this world and against spiritual wickedness in high places, unquote. Amen. Ever wonder why it's the Roman Catholic FBI that's going after the Roman Catholic Mafia? Ever notice that? You got Roman Catholic FBI agents going after Roman Catholic mafiosos. Roman Catholicism is the heart and soul of that agitation. Concluding, page 24 in Roman numerals of the introductory address. Therefore, ministers and churches, hear the words of, quote, the Son of God, the Amen, who hath his eyes like unto a flame of fire. Quote, I have a few things against you, because you suffer that woman Jezebel, who calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit fornication, and to eat things sacrificed to idols. Be watchful and strengthen the things which remain, that are ready to die. Be zealous, therefore, and repent. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. Unquote. End of introductory address to the great work of Richard Baxter, titled The Juggling of Jesuit Juggling, 40 Popish Frauds Detected and Disclosed. This introductory address. And the guy who gives the introductory address, he has withheld his name. I find that intriguing. Okay, I trust you enjoyed that. And thank you for the dear brother who sent that to me. It's a wonderful masterpiece that everybody needs to have. So, today is July 5th, 2023, the day after Independence Day. May the Lord bless you as you serve Him according to His Word, the AV 1611 Reformation English Bible. Till we meet again, Maranatha.